I'm here today with Carolyn B. Helsel, author of Anxious to Talk About It, Helping White Christians Talk Faithfully About Racism. Carolyn is a professor of preaching at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, where she has taught since 2015. Carolyn grew up in San Antonio, Texas, and has moved across the country for education and work. And in every setting, she noticed that the white people in her communities, including herself, remained silent on racism. As she became more aware of racism, beginning in seminary in the early 2000s, she felt called to help white communities better understand racism and deepen their capacity to hear the painful stories of others and join people of color to work against racism. Carolyn's a minister in the Presbyterian Church USA. She holds degrees from Emory University and Princeton Seminary. Carolyn has been featured on NPR and in the Presbyterian Outlook and has led workshops for the White Privilege Conference and the Festival of Homiletics. So Carolyn, thanks so much for joining us today. It's really a pleasure to meet you and learn about your work.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian.
So as I mentioned to Carolyn earlier, I mean, when I first heard the title of her book, I said, okay, well, I've got to learn more about this because it fits so well with, several of the initiatives that I've been working on. But before we dive into that, maybe, Carolyn, you can tell people a little bit more about your background than what I had just briefly mentioned.
Yeah, sure. Well, I grew up in Texas, in San Antonio, and was part of a very large Presbyterian church in downtown, and felt like I was really formed in the faith throughout my years before I went off to college, and went to a Christian college, again, where I was feeling like I was being formed in the faith, learning about the history of Christianity and studying scripture. But it wasn't until, again, my seminary experience in the early 2000s after college where I learned that racism was still a problem that people were experiencing today, and that it wasn't taken care of in the 60s by the civil rights movement. And so wondering why throughout my faith journey and in these wonderful communities that were really so faithful and full of compassionate people who are doing other great things in the world had been totally silent on the issue of racism. And so I was wondering, how do I bring it back, knowing that congregations continue to be segregated by race, knowing that I would probably return to serve some sort of congregation or community that was predominantly white. How do I have these conversations in these white communities? I served as a hospital chaplain on the U.S.-Mexico border right after seminary, and then served as an associate pastor at a small congregation before returning to where I went to seminary to be in the admissions department as associate director of admissions, and sitting around the admissions table, hearing conversations about race and wanting to recruit a more diverse student body, and yet knowing from students there that the atmosphere wasn't conducive to feeling like they fully belonged. Again, trying to figure out, how do we have these conversations? Because clearly, as white people, we're not getting it. We're not really understanding what is going on. So that took me on a kind of a deeper quest, a deeper dive, saying, okay, I need to start reading, learning as much as I can. So I went on to work on a PhD focusing on how to help white preachers preach about racism. Since I was a white preacher, and hearing from the people of color who had done anti-racism work for decades, saying, go back to your own people, speak to the people who are most like you, and because it's all kind of a way of continuing to work on ourselves, right? We're not coming from a place of a soapbox or better than you, better than thou, but it's always us acknowledging, we're still learning about how to talk about racism. We're still undoing the racism we've imbibed all our years. So it's not something that I come at as someone who feels like I'm done with it or I've arrived, but as someone who, continues to realize I'm unlearning the racism that's part of our society. So that's what led me to Anxious to Talk About It, trying to help other people talk about racism.
Wow.
And then a few other books in the meantime. So
you've been working on this for a long time. I mean, if you did your PhD, in it, so that's really great. You've got a lot of experience.
It's a lot of reading and a lot of talking to people about it. because when people are asking you, what are you doing your PhD in? It's usually, the 1 second line, helping white people talk about racism. They're like, wow. And either that stops the conversation or gets people going and they want to learn more. So that's ongoing practice as a PhD student. And then I started teaching at Austin Seminary in 2015. And so since then, in my classes and in my community work, kind of continuing to have that kind of experience and goal of trying to help white people talk about racism.
Good. So before we get more into the new book, can you talk about the previous books that you had published?
Yeah, sure. Well, the first edition of Anxious to Talk About It came out in 2018. And in that book, I'm really trying to kind of lay a groundwork in my mind to the people that I know in my life and in my family, because I'm back here in Austin, which isn't far from where I grew up and isn't far from my relatives. I've got a great extended family here. And knowing so many people who voted very differently than I did and who voted for a candidate who in my mind was clearly saying things that were racist and that were insinuating kind of racist ideas and labels. And I thought, how did they not see this? How did they not catch this about this particular candidate? And so speaking in a way that I felt like I was trying to speak to them and to say, okay, this is how I came to understand about racism, but also to name for those that are talking about racism now that just using definitions, just doing certain kind of educational experiences aren't always going to help people come to realize what racism is, because we all have our own stories. It's not just that we hear the word racism and we're all on the same page about what that means. We have stories in the back of our heads of our own experiences, of what we've been told, of what we've grown up with, since each of us comes from a different background, a different generation, and all of us have different experiences of being told what racism is and what it looks like. And so you can't just counter that story with a definition. You have to listen to that story first, and then you kind of have to bridge that with new stories. So that's what the first version of Anxious to Talk About It was really trying to do. Soon on the heels of that came Preaching About Racism, really drawing to the core group of folks that I wrote my dissertation for, being white preachers or preachers speaking to white congregations, looking at how we read the Bible. If our experience isn't about racism, but we have all of these other things that help us tell us, how to read the Bible, it might not be something that we talk about in our sermons. So how do we make that more of a pressing issue and let that rise to the top of our concerns? And then I wanted to help the parents that I was in conversation with in my own neighborhood talk about racism, but not just racism, the other ways that as we're raising children, we need to be equipping our kids for the diversity that is all around them and that's in the world, and how can they be agents of change to make the world a more inclusive, safe place for all their peers. So the ABCs of diversity, helping kids and ourselves embrace our differences, co-authored with Y. Joy Harris-Smith, and she is a friend of mine that I met at seminary. She lives in the greater New York area, and she's raising two kids that are younger than mine. So between the two of us, and I've got older kids who are now entering middle school and high school, and she's got kids on the younger end. We're able to kind of think through together, how do we have these conversations? And then the second to most recent book, The Flawed Family of God, co-authored by Song Mi Susie Park. She's one of my colleagues here at the seminary, teaches Old Testament, and she wanted to write a book that would help us rethink some of these stories that people hear when we're told that there's this biblical family. How do we have biblical families? Well, actually, the families in the Bible, particularly in Genesis, were not as great of role models as we might want them to be. So also did a lot of interviewing for that to help us draw from modern families who are negotiating similar dilemmas to what they're experiencing in the Bible, and who are giving us great examples of how they've worked it out in faithful ways, and also provide us a picture of some of the diversity of families today too. So that's been that was a lot of fun to write. And then after the murder of George Floyd last May, and in June, all of the protests around the world, my publisher at Chalice Press, Brad Lyons, called me up and said, look, I think it's time to revise Anxious to Talk About It. The conversation's changing so fast, and I think there's a lot more that we can be offering folks. And so I agreed to do a second edition, revised version of Anxious to Talk About It, helping white people talk faithfully about racism. And in it, I include some other content, some other stories, as well as a whole new chapter to also help us think through, again, how we can be strategic in having these conversations, because it is a strategy. And we've had different strategies throughout time of talking about racism, trying to work against racism. And some strategies have worked and some strategies have not worked as well. For instance, the colorblind strategy that people used in the 80s and 90s didn't work to eradicate racism or to raise up people who were not racist. So how do we think through the effectiveness of our strategies in trying to work towards a world where people can have honest conversations about what pains us and how we can work together towards a richer sense of community across our races and other sources of difference.
Well, you've got a great set of books, and it's so wonderful that you have chosen to attack some difficult topics, because I think that's what we need. So thank you for doing those. There have been some other books recently that kind of urge white folks to rethink racism. How would you say that your book differs from theirs?
I think that many of the books currently out and that came out specifically for white people have often been a form of speaking to the choir. So people who are already aware that racism is a problem, people who are already on board but may feel like they have a lot to learn, who are eager to soak this up as hard as it may be. At the same time, there are plenty of people who have been told that racism is something that is for kind of a small group of people who are self-interested and who are only talking about racism as a way of kind of promoting themselves. And there's other people that are saying that racism is a way of talking about critical race theory, which is an anti-American ideology that will destroy our country. I mean, these are literally the kinds of phrases that some portion of our society are hearing from Fox News, from Tucker Carlson, these kinds of messages that people are receiving. So how do you speak to folks who aren't necessarily interested in reading White Fragility or other books that have addressed white people, when they are not ready to feel guilty or shame and feel like that's actually really a terrible thing to do to white people, to make them feel guilty or ashamed. So my book is really about trying to what my husband has called me in the past, a white person whisperer, in the sense of really trying to speak to people who may have their guard up against these kinds of conversations. Racism skeptics is a word that Dr. David Camp, the dialogue guy, that's his name of his website, talks about trying to address. Talking to people who may be different from us politically, or just may have been part of a different generation and aren't quite comfortable with the ways that people are talking about racism today. So how do we give them a context? How do we bring them on board so that we can be part of this conversation together? I'm not under any illusions that we're going to be changing everybody's minds, but I do hope that we can continue to have deep conversations. And one of the things that I do in this second edition is give a history leading up to the Civil War of the amount of political work Christians did in arguing for and against slavery. White Christians, Black Christians obviously were not advocating for slavery, but white Christians on both the for and against side politically advocating for political changes. And so you see impacts on the legislature that's passed in the early colonies and then in the states leading up to the Civil War, and how those political movements, again, make a huge difference. Today, a lot of folks feel like, well, as a Christian, I'm not that comfortable out in the political realm. I'm comfortable in church and I'm comfortable talking about it with people that I know. But in terms of trying to convince people who are on a different political side, that's, I'm not sure that I can have those conversations. But I really want to make the case that talking about racism isn't partisan, but it's always political. It's not partisan in that there have been people on both political parties who have been racist and who have advocated for racist policies. And yet it's always a political issue in that it relates to policies that we continue to make that continue to make it harder for people of color to thrive and to vote and to be able to live as full citizens in this society. So that's what I hope to do in this second edition, is really give folks more tools and more strategies for having these conversations.
Well, again, it's good that you're kind of like addressing the toughest part of the toughest problem, I would say, in that, you're trying to convince people that don't even think it's an issue,
right,
to deal with the issue.
Yes.
That's the toughest of the tough, so to speak. So, that's really great. I mean, it's so badly needed, right? I mean, as you said, it's one thing to preach to the choir, but it's another thing to, convince people who need to be convinced. So
right.
That's a tough thing.
Mm-hmm.
So in addition to the book, do you do any kind of speaking or training around these topics?
I do. I'm often invited to lead kind of training events for churches or for denomination at the denominational level, to do kind of curriculum things, also to lead kind of courses online for folks. So there's a number of different ways that I'm engaged in this on a kind of speaking level. I speak at conferences and speak at local churches. Churches will have me over to speak to them as well. So on kind of a top level, speaking to the leaders as well as to speaking to lay people and having conversations. I do that a lot in my area, in Texas, as well as kind of around the country. And even with COVID, we were able to do a lot of that on Zoom. So that made it really interesting because all of the faces were right there as you're speaking on Zoom. It's different when people are all in a room and they can look away and, or they're sitting around tables. You're not sure what their facial expressions are, but on Zoom, everybody's right there. You can, you can see if they're agreeing with you or if they're having trouble. So in some ways that can make it better.
Isn't that an amazing dynamic? I mean, I've been doing all these writers conferences online and so many people have commented on how it feels more intimate than when you're in person. Which,
Absolutely.
Not the feedback that I would have expected going into it, but it's been consistent.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm always fascinated to hear authors talk about how they got their first book deal. So if you go back to that, how did that happen for you?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, this is such a great story. And it also lifts up why 4 out of my 5 books have been with Chalice Press. The one I wrote with Susie Park, she invited me, and she had already talked with Westminster John Knox Press, which is also a great publisher. But with Chalice Press, I had submitted I forget what the form is called. It's like an author idea form where it's kind of like a convince me proposal. It's like, here are the things that you have to know about this book. And if you were to tell me, what if I were to tell you, this is the common perception, but I tell you, kind of the Jesus sayings, you have heard, but I say to you. And they want you to pitch your book in that same way. So I had done that, but mainly in my mind that I was writing a book about preaching about racism to preachers, because that was the first book that I thought that I would write. It came out of my dissertation, but I was rewriting it for preachers. And when I sat down and spoke about it with Brad Lyons, he eventually got back to me in October of 2016 and said, at the big meeting of scholars, the AAR, American Academy of Religion, or SBL, Society for Biblical Literature, let's have a meeting at the exhibitors hall where Chalice Press is going to have a book table. So we'll meet there. And as we sat at the table, he said, well, have you thought about writing for a broader audience? Now, you'd think that the answer would clearly be yes. But the way our academic training goes is that you read more and more to become a specialist in a particular area. And on the one hand, it means that you can speak to only a few people who can read and understand your dissertation, but it also in some ways convinces you that you're only qualified to speak to people in this particular field about this particular subject. So while there's plenty of other people talking about the imposter syndrome as you teach, but this is another form of that imposter syndrome. You feel like, well, I can only talk to people about preaching because that's what I've been, talking about. But he asked me, no, these ideas that you're talking about, I think would help a broader audience too. And, writing it just for preachers may not get to all the people that you want to help reach. So he helped convince me that really Anxious to Talk About It could be written for a broader audience. And now Anxious to Talk About It was not my idea. And that was something that came out of the board of trustees of Chalice Press. They were talking about different ideas. I wanted it to be called something like Healing White Anxiety or something like that. But somebody named this because it was really, addressing that anxiety that people have to talk about this subject. But when I heard Anxious to Talk About It, I'm like, that's brilliant. That's great.
It's a great title. And I mean, that's not unusual for, an author to have one title in their head and the publishers to, come up with something else. That's typical.
Yeah. And what's helpful is that, I could hear that double entendre,
Right. I like that aspect of it, quite frankly. I mean, the second subtitle explains which Anxious that we're talking about. But when you first read the first part of it, that's a question in your mind.
Yeah. And there's so many people who are anxious to talk about it I really want to get to talking about this. And so it's helpful to be kind of aware that, for folks that are aware that this is a problem, they want to have these conversations. And there are plenty of people who are not anxious to talk about it in the sense of being eager, but rather full of hesitation. So it works really great.
Good. Well, I hope the book has been getting a good reception since the second edition came out.
Yeah, well, it just launched a couple of weeks ago. So, we've had a few great conversations already and some folks that are really glad to have, some other resources for these conversations.
Good. So what do you hope that people will most take away from the new book?
I hope that it will give people more strategies in their mind, thinking through, okay, how do I have this conversation with my neighbor? These are the things that I'm going to do differently in having this conversation. And to give people a sense of urgency to be part of the political process, that working against racism requires that we engage in politics. And so I don't come down one way or another politically in the book. I don't say, go out and vote this way, because I want people that are committed to making policy changes wherever they are, to be consciously thinking, how do we challenge the ways that policies have been harmful to people of color? And so for them to think about it in that lens, how do we work against racism in our policies? And in our politics. So those two things, giving people more strategies for talking with their neighbor, with their family member about racism, more kind of internal ways for them to process it themselves, and that they can have that courage to engage the political process to work against racism on the political stage.
Good. So does the book include a discussion guide, or is there an accompanying discussion guide?
We have a discussion guide that's online. There's also at the end of each chapter questions for reflection and discussion. So the book is meant to kind of as your own personal workbook, using those pages at the end for discussion and reflection, to write in the margins, to write there on the blank page about your own thoughts and responses. But then also to say, okay, how can I take this into a small group setting and have this in maybe in my church or in my community group, have these conversations about this. And so in addition to the questions for reflection and discussion at the end of each chapter, online there's a kind of a study guide for folks who want to engage it in small groups. Good.
So do you have any plans for additional books that you're able to talk about at this point?
That's a great question. Because so much has happened in the span of, 2018 to 2021, and these books have all come out. This summer, I was planning on just not writing for any book. But as often is the case, you can't help but have some ideas bubble up. So when and if I start writing, putting pen to paper, I will be thinking about these kind of three broad subjects. One is kind of the way that the artistic process kind of brings us into a connection with our spirituality. How is kind of art a function of not only how we ourselves receive spirituality, but also in our churches and in leadership, how we're able to use art in ways that connect folks. The other subject was, again, creation care. We have a small plot of land here, like a 1/4 acre small, lot. And we've totally taken out invasive trees and have replanted other vegetation. We've got a big garden and a wildflower, butterfly garden. And I've been raising chickens since the beginning of the pandemic. And so this idea of how caring for creation is also caring for ourselves in this kind of symbiotic way. And what does that look like to kind of get our spiritual cues from, chickens, but something that I feel really strongly about. And then thirdly is this question of kind of interreligious proclamation. I'm a preacher within a tradition, but I'm also in networks of clergy from other faith traditions, and have heard just amazing, sermons or, talks from my colleagues who are clergy members from these other faith traditions. And so I want to kind of think through and have more conversations with them about what makes a good talk in your congregation, in your worshiping community, and how do you develop your sermon ideas and so forth. So those are kind of the three broad areas that I'm interested in that don't have any kind of book. There's no book on the horizon for them to be collected in, but it's just kind of things that I'm interested in writing about in my free time.
Well, those do all sound really interesting. So good luck with pursuing those. I hope that they happen, and I hope that they go well. But I also have to feel that there's got to be a follow-on to Anxious to Talk About It too, because, as you said, the amount of change that took place in the 3 years between the first two editions got published, we all know that this is not an area that's going to stand still.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, even in the period since I turned in this edition in September or October of last year, that was when all of the critical race theory, what I call the boogeyman, idea has been circulating in media sources and in communities. So in my own community where there's been a strong push among parents for a DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant to talk with our school district, our school board, and help our school become more consciously anti-racist at the high school and middle school and elementary school levels. So many people pushed back, and we had 2 members of our community run for school board on a very anti-DEI platform, saying, this is all based in critical race theory, which is un-American, which is ripping our country apart, really taking these tropes that, led to, President Trump in the fall saying that no federal government could do any kind of diversity training. I mean, made that, clear that that wasn't something they could do. I mean, which is such a backlash movement, rather than seeing all of these protests around the world trying to lift up the plight of Black and brown men and women who have been shot by the police and by vigilantes, rather than saying, let's have these conversations. The move politically was to say, no, there's this thing out there called critical race theory, which is basically Marxist, and which is going to lead us towards communism, and which we have to get out of our, make sure we're not indoctrinating our children in. So already there's a huge backlash, which I've seen work very successfully, throughout our society. So I might have to be writing about that at some point.
Good. Good. I'm glad. And again, really important stuff, right, that needs to be dealt with. So anyway, Carolyn, so wonderful to meet with you and speak with you and learn about your work. And congratulations on all the things that you've done, in particular, this new edition of Anxious to Talk About It.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. It's great to talk with you. And thank you for your great questions. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much.